Imagine thousands of people gathered in a public square, all eyes fixed on a single man about to face an unthinkable fate. The crowd is buzzing with a mix of excitement and horror. In the center stands a prisoner whose body will soon be literally torn apart by horses. This isn't a scene from a horror movie or a medieval fantasy. It actually happened in Paris, less than 300 years ago. And it gets even crazier. The victim saw it coming. As he was led to his doom, he reportedly muttered that the day will be hard, which might be the understatement of the century. Welcome to one of the most brutal executions in history, the story of Robert-François Damiens. Why should you care about a gruesome execution from 1757? Aside from being a mind-blowing true story, it's a stark reminder of how far society has come. Back then, this kind of torture was considered justice. By the end of this video, you'll not only hear every jaw-dropping detail of Damiens' punishment, but you'll also appreciate living in a time when cruelty like this is unthinkable. Stick around, because this dark tale shows the extremes of human punishment. And trust me, you'll be talking about it long after it's over. Robert-François Damiens was not a famous noble or a general. He was a domestic servant with a troubled past. But on January 5th, 1757, he did something that shook France to its core. He attempted to assassinate King Louis XV. Armed with a small knife, Damiens managed to stab the king, but only inflicted a minor wound. The king survived with just a scratch, but that didn't matter. An attack on the king was the ultimate crime. France hadn't seen an attempted regicide, king-killing, in over a century, so people were stunned. Who was this would-be king killer, and what would be done to him? The authorities lost no time in arresting Damiens. He was interrogated and sentenced to a punishment beyond anything you can imagine. In the 18th century, trying to kill the king was considered parricide, as if you tried to kill your own father, and it was met with the harshest penalty available. They weren't going to just behead Damiens or hang him. No, the French court decided to make him an example. What came next was a sentence designed to terrify anyone who might dare to harm the king. When Damiens was found guilty, the court spelled out a horrific public execution, almost like a twisted script. According to the official sentence, which was recorded in great detail, Damiens was condemned to make the amende honorable, a public apology, and then to suffer a laundry list of tortures. They literally wrote down what would happen to him, step by step, and it's one of the most graphic things you'll ever hear. They would tear his flesh with red-hot pincers, burn his right hand with boiling sulfur, pour molten lead and boiling oil into his wounds, and then tie his limbs to 4 horses to tear him apart. Finally, his body would be burned to ashes and his ashes scattered to the wind. This wasn't just execution. This was theatrical torture. The goal was to inflict as much pain as possible before killing him, in front of as many people as possible. It was a punishment reserved for the absolute worst crimes, like high treason or regicide, and Damiens became the last person in French history to suffer this fate. If you're thinking, this is insane, you're absolutely right. But in 1757, the authorities believed such extreme cruelty would instill fear and obedience. They wanted to send a message: attack the king, and this is what happens to you. And so, the stage was set for a public spectacle of pain. On March 28, 1757, the show began. Thousands of spectators packed into the Place de la Grève in Paris to witness the execution of Damiens. People traveled from all over. This was the event of the year. The crowd included everyone from common folks to members of high society. In fact, reports say even fashionable ladies of the nobility were present, watching with morbid curiosity until the very end. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of carnival and nightmare. Many were anxious or sickened by what they might see, yet they could not look away. This was public entertainment in the 18th century, as dark as it sounds. Damiens was brought out onto the scaffold in the center of the square. He was stripped down to just a shirt and exposed to the cool spring air and the eyes of the massive crowd. You can imagine him squinting at the daylight after weeks in a dungeon, surrounded by jeering onlookers. He knew exactly what was coming. The whole grotesque plan had been explained to him. Remember, he even predicted, "It's going to be a rough day." Talk about gallows humor. And it was about to begin. First, the executioners went to work on torturing Damiens before the final blow. They started with an old device called the boots, which was nothing as innocent as footwear. It was a device that crushed his legs. They placed his legs between planks and likely tightened screws until his bones and flesh were being squeezed mercilessly. Damien's screams probably started here. The pain was excruciating, but it was only step one. Next, they brought out red-hot pincers, essentially giant pliers heated until glowing red. The executioners used these to rip chunks of flesh from his body. They clawed at his arms, legs, chest, even his breasts, tearing out bloody pieces of skin. Eyewitness accounts say the executioner had to tug multiple times at some spots because it was so hard to tear the flesh away. With each ripping, Damiens let out blood-curdling screams. The square filled with the sound of his agony. Some in the crowd were horrified. One famous witness, the adventurer Giacomo Casanova, later wrote that he had to turn away and cover his ears at the sound of Damien's shrieks. But other spectators were oddly enthusiastic, leaning in to see each gruesome moment. Believe it or not, some people cheered as the torture went on. Yes, human nature has had dark moments. They made sure Damien suffered in particular ways symbolic of his crime. The hand that held the knife, his right hand, was burned with burning sulfur. Imagine someone pouring a chemical fire onto your hand until it's charred and useless. That happened to him. And then came the grand finale of the torture phase. The executioners had prepared a cauldron of boiling liquid, a nasty mix of molten lead, boiling oil, tar, and wax. They poured this scalding concoction into the open wounds all over Damien's body. The liquid sizzled as it hit raw flesh. Smoke rose from his wounds. It's hard to even narrate how awful that must have been. The pain was beyond imagination. Burning, searing metal inside torn flesh. Damiens begged for mercy, crying out to God and anyone who would listen. The crowd could literally smell the torture. The scent of burnt skin and hot metal filled the air. At this point, Damiens had been through hell, and he was still alive, conscious, and in agony. But the executioners weren't done. In a final act of cruelty before the main execution, the lead executioner cut off Damien's genitals. Yes, they emasculated him on the spot, sliced off his private parts. The pain of that alone is unimaginable, but in Damien's condition, it was just one more horror added to a list of horrors. One can only hope he was going into shock by then. The torture had lasted quite a while, and by now, many people in the crowd were pale or crying, while others were still riveted. But the worst was yet to come, the part everyone had been waiting for, the part that gave this video its title. The attendants brought out 4 horses and prepared for the dreadful finale. With Damiens already maimed and suffering, the executioners now prepared to dismember him alive by tying his limbs to horses. They secured ropes around each of his arms and legs, attaching the other ends to the harnesses of 4 strong horses positioned facing north, south, east, and west. This method of execution is called drawing and quartering. Drawing meaning pulling apart, and quartering meaning splitting into 4 pieces. It was so rare in France that even the executioners weren't experienced with it. In fact, this was the first time in living memory it was being done, so everyone was on edge. At the signal, the horsemen whipped the horses to gallop in opposite directions. The ropes went taut, and Damien's body jerked violently. But guess what? The human body is stubborn. His limbs did not separate easily. Instead of a clean, quick quartering, Damiens was now being stretched and yanked mercilessly at his arms and legs without yet dying. He must have felt his shoulders and hips dislocate with brutal snaps. He screamed even louder. The horses pulled and pulled, but Damien's tendons and bones held on. The executioners tried again and again, urging the horses on in a frenzy. The massive crowd was in a stunned silence, punctuated by gasps, cries, and shouts to push the horses harder. Minutes went by, and Damiens was still in one piece, a horribly mangled piece, but not yet quartered. This was not how the executioners expected it to go. So, they decided to up the force. They brought in 2 additional horses, attaching more horses to the task, so that now 6 horses were pulling, 2 on each leg and 1 on each arm. The executioners whipped and shouted, and the horses strained with all their might. Imagine the scene, 6 horses neighing and pulling, a man's half-torn body in the center, still somehow alive, and a crowd of thousands holding their breath. Still, the limbs wouldn't come off. The official report from the time noted that the horses were unaccustomed to this work. They simply weren't pulling in the right way to dismember a man. At this point, Damiens had been enduring the agony of being pulled apart for perhaps 15 minutes or more, on top of all the torture before. It was a nightmare beyond nightmares. He was reportedly crying out, "Jesus, help me!" and praying, while even some onlookers were shouting for the executioners to finish it. The executioners themselves were exhausted and aghast. This was turning into a prolonged fiasco. The chief executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, actually called for a pause and spoke to the officials on site. He basically said, "This isn't working. Do you want me to use a knife to cut him up?" The authorities initially had told him to do everything without cutting. They wanted the horses to do all the work. So Sanson had been trying to quarter Damiens purely by force. But now, seeing the torture dragging on and the daylight fading, it was getting toward evening, they finally gave permission to do whatever it took. Sanson and his aides then took knives and began cutting into Damiens' joints, slicing the tendons and ligaments at his shoulders and thighs. Essentially, they pre-severed the limbs partway, almost hacking him into pieces manually while he was still alive and conscious. With deep cuts weakening the attachment of his limbs, the horses were urged to pull again. And at last, one of Damiens' legs gave way, tearing completely off his body. Then the other leg was ripped away. Then an arm, and the final arm followed. In a gruesome sequence, his body was dismembered piece by piece. Eyewitnesses say that as each limb finally tore off, a roar of reaction burst from the crowd, some in horror, some in morbid excitement. It was a spectacle unlike anything Paris had seen. In the end, poor Damiens was reduced to just a bloody torso on the scaffold, with his 4 limbs hanging by ropes or laying on the ground. Incredibly, some accounts claim Damiens was still alive at this moment. We can't know for sure. Perhaps it was just muscle spasms or reflex. But one onlooker swore they saw the torso still moving its jaw, as if trying to speak after the limbs were gone. The executioners quickly moved to finish the job. They had a pile of wood and straw ready nearby. They took Damiens' limbs and thrown them onto the fire. Then they lifted what remained of his torso and placed it on the burning pyre. Flames engulfed the remains of this tortured man. Mercifully, if Damiens somehow had any life left in him, it would have been snuffed out almost instantly by the fire. The crowd watched as the executioners burned everything. They were under orders to leave absolutely no trace of Damiens. His body was consumed by the blaze, turned to ash. They kept the fire going for hours to make sure every last piece was reduced to cinders. By late that night, the last embers of Damiens were still glowing. Finally, the ashes were collected and thrown to the wind, scattered anonymously so that nothing of him would remain. Robert-François Damiens was gone. All that was left was the memory of what people had witnessed, a memory that would haunt France for years. You'd think after such an ordeal, the authorities would be satisfied, but they went even further to erase Damiens from history. The French court ordered that his family be punished too. They razed his house to the ground as if to wipe out any trace of where he lived. His father, wife, and even his young daughter were banished from France for life. His brothers and sisters were forced to change their last name so that Damiens would disappear from memory. It was a total attempt at erasing this man's existence, a punishment extended beyond the grave. However, the irony is that Damiens became infamous precisely because of how brutal his execution was. Far from being forgotten, his name and story lived on in a notorious way. People all over Europe heard about the man who was torn apart by horses. In France, many were disgusted and began to question whether the old ways of justice had gone too far. Philosophers and writers of the Enlightenment era later cited Damiens' execution as an example of barbarity. For instance, the Italian thinker Cesare Beccaria directly referenced this execution when arguing against torture and cruel capital punishment just a few years later. Even decades on, during the French Revolution, opponents of the monarchy would point to Damiens' fate as evidence of the king's cruelty. The execution also found its way into literature. Charles Dickens vividly described it in A Tale of Two Cities, albeit in fictional form, to illustrate the horrors of the Ancien Regime. And the philosopher Michel Foucault famously opened his book Discipline and Punish with the graphic details of Damiens' death, to mark the contrast between the savage punishments of the past and the prison system of modern times. In short, Damiens' death backfired as propaganda. Instead of simply terrorizing people into obedience, it became a rallying point for critics of absolute monarchy. One immediate effect: after 1757, no one in France was ever executed by dismemberment again. Damiens was the last. The sheer horror of what happened to him effectively put an end to the form of punishment. Future executions, even for regicides, would be carried out in less ghastly ways. The guillotine, introduced a few decades later, was actually intended to be a more humane form of execution, swift and relatively painless by comparison. So, what do we take away from the ghastly tale of Robert-François Damiens? For one, it's a stark lesson in how justice and human rights have evolved. In Damiens' time, the state believed it had to display absolute power through fear and pain. Today we look back on that with horror and a sense of relief that we've left those days behind. This story also shows the danger of fanaticism on both sides. Damiens was fanatic enough to attack a king, and the king's men were fanatic enough to exact a revenge so terrible that it became legendary. If you found this story shocking, fascinating, or informative, then do me a favor. Hit that like button to let me know you enjoyed this deep dive into dark history. Leave a comment. What's your reaction to Damiens' execution? Could you have watched it if you were there, or would you have looked away? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this one. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable true stories from history. I've got plenty more crazy tales, maybe not this gruesome, but just as intriguing, coming up, and you won't want to miss them. Thank you for watching till the end of this intense story. Give yourself a pat on the back for handling it. It was a rough ride, no pun intended. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video.